And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Tuesday, August 6, 2024. And looking at the sea ice, we still have a little ice left here along the Beaufort Sea coastline along the Arctic coast, but it's been rapid melt-off. We've had southerly winds with just very warm air. In fact, all-time record high temperature today was set at Dead Horse, 88 degrees. That beats the old record of 85 degrees set on July 13th in 2016. So a remarkable couple of days of some just excessive heat up here along the North Slope and Arctic coastline. But otherwise, we expect rapid melt-off along this region. Still generally open water here along the Chukchi Sea coastline, at least the Alaska side, though we do have ice along the Russian coastline that persists. And looking at the weather map, there's a series of lows, one in the Chukchi Sea, one up near St. Lawrence, another one in the southeast Bering. It's this front here that's a conduit for an atmospheric river, a deep push of moisture coming from subtropical regions of the Pacific. And that's taking aim right at the eastern Kenai, western Prince William Sound through Thursday afternoon, and we're looking at the potential of 3 to 6 inches of rainfall as the result. And further east, generally dry conditions will hold here across the Panhandle, eastern mainland, especially along the Alcan border, where temperatures once again come Wednesday will be up into the 80s. That's the last kind of vestige of warm temperatures, and there could be an isolated 80-degree reading in especially southern Panhandle. But gradually, as we go through this week, we're going to see temperatures slowly cool from west to east across the mainland. And again, Wednesday, we'll see that feed of moisture into the eastern Kenai. And then come Thursday, that spigot should begin to diminish by Thursday afternoon and evening, and not be so much of a factor. But by then, too, we're going to start to see a bit more in the way of cloud cover overspreading the far eastern end of the Panhandle. Still generally dry, though, across the Panhandle, but the eastern mainland along the Alcan border will certainly see more in the way of cloud cover. And then here comes the next low. This will become a stronger low as it works its way eastward across the Bering. That'll be approaching the lower Yukon Delta by Saturday. So as the system crosses the Aleutians, it'll have rain and wind. It'll push up into portions of the Alaska Peninsula, southwest coast, and along the west coast, including the Seward Peninsula, especially by the time we get into Saturday. So in the meantime, the marine forecast for the inner channels of the Panhandle: south winds 15 knots, waves a couple of feet there in Lynn Canal. Northwest winds to 10 knots, Stevens Passage down through Dixon Entrance around Metlakatla with waves a couple of feet. For the outer nearshore waters, south of Sitka, west winds 15 knots there offshore at Craig with swells of 4 feet. Southeast winds west of Sitka up to outside of Gustavus at 10 knots, turning easterly 10 to 15 knots with swells of 6 to 7 feet outside of Yakutat Bay to Cape Suckling. And on Thursday, look for southeast winds to 15 knots, waves 2-3 feet within Lynn Canal, but northwest 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3 foot waves. Stevens Passage down to Dixon Entrance. For the outer coast, kind of a mix of winds, 10 to 15 knots, and generally swells are going to be around 5 feet there in the nearshore waters within 15 nautical miles of shore. As we look to the northwestern Gulf, the strongest winds, southeast winds to 25 knots outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, 7 to 8 foot swells. East winds to 25 knots, Prince William Sound, 4 or 5 foot waves there. Northeast winds 15 knots, upper middle Cook Inlet, and then southeast winds there at the lower portion of Cook Inlet and the entrance with waves running 4 or 5 feet. And then on Thursday, still look for south-southeast winds in the vicinity of Prince William Sound and outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, 15 to maybe as high as 20 knots. Lightest winds off the Kenai coast and here in the lower portion of Cook Inlet. Variable winds around 10 knots, waves there only a couple of feet. Winds will be southwesterly at 15 knots across Kodiak Island on Wednesday. Highest waves east of Akiak there at about 8 feet. As we go down the Alaska Peninsula, south-southwest winds 10 to 15 knots will be more variable here off of False Pass, Sand Point. 4 to 5 foot swells on the North Pacific side, generally 2-foot waves, Bristol Bay, maybe as much as 4 feet north of Cold Bay. Southwest winds around 15 knots continue in the vicinity of Kodiak Island for Thursday, but generally variable winds around 10 knots across much of the Alaska Peninsula. Swells only 3 feet on the North Pacific side and 2 to 3 feet at best there on the Bering side. The Aleutian chain will generally see westerly winds 15 knots on Wednesday, with the exception once you get out toward Kiska and Shemya, southwest winds to 20 knots. And then Thursday, look for variable winds generally around 10 to maybe 15 knots. The eastern third of the Aleutians, as we get near and west of Adak, south winds will increase to 25 knots, kind of a hint of the next system to be approaching the western Aleutians, moving up through the western Bering. As we go into Friday, that'll be a stronger system, likely could bring some gale force winds to sections of the Aleutians. Now, across the southwest coast, south winds to 50 knots into Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Bay. Kind of a mixed bag of winds here along the lower Yukon coast. Northeast 10 knots there, 2-foot waves, but south winds 15 knots. The wider expanse of Norton Sound with 3-foot waves, variable winds out toward St. Matthew, and northwest winds at the Pribilovs there at 15 knots with 4 to 5 foot swells. On Thursday, look for southwest winds 10 to 15 knots into Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays. Westerly winds 15 to 20 knots along the lower Yukon coast, Hooper Bay to Imanak, and then south winds to 20 knots there within Norton Sound with 3-4 foot waves. For areas south of the Bering Strait, winds will be southerly 15 knots along the west side of the Seward Peninsula, 4-foot swells, but as much as 25 knots on the west side of St. Lawrence Island with swells to 6 feet. 10 knot southerly winds lower Chukchi Sea, 4 or 5 foot waves as you get north of the Bering Strait. 15 knots Point Lay up to Utqiagvik, 3-foot waves. Still generally a southerly flow to 15 knots along the Arctic coast, though turning more easterly to 20 knots at Kaktovik on Wednesday. And for Thursday, same situation, east winds maybe not quite as strong, 10 knots there at Kaktovik. South winds 10 to 15 knots, 2 to 3 foot offshore flow there along the Arctic coast. And then as we drop down through the lower Chukchi Sea, again, kind of a mixed bag of winds, 10 to 15 knots. Waves generally running 3 feet or so. And then on the west side of the Seward Peninsula, south winds of 15 knots there off of Wales and Port Clarence, but westerly winds on the north side of St. Lawrence with waves generally running 2 to 3 feet.